Hi, I am Reina Lombardi and I own Florida Art Therapy Services. And I am here with Melissa Maki today. She's a licensed clinical social worker and she sees clients here in the practice. And she is kind of our um, resident expert on the topic of domestic violence, relationship abuse, or sometimes it's called interpersonal violence. And she actually teaches a continuing education course for other licensed mental health professionals, which is part of our continuing ed that we have to do every 2 years to maintain our license. And so she teaches a course on the topic for folks, and it is almost renewal time. We're going to be renewing in March. So if you need that, if you're watching and you need that, definitely check it out. It's on demand. You can do it at your own pace. But thanks so much for being willing to talk on here today about this really important topic. And maybe you should start by asking you to kind of share a little bit about the differences between domestic violence and interpersonal violence and why we're kind of calling them two different things.
Thank you, Rena. You say such nice words about me all the time. I appreciate it. Yeah, that's a good question. I would say in the last 5 or 6 years, had heard the term interpersonal violence, and that's when I really kind of got interested in that topic and wondering what is that and how is that different from domestic violence. Um, I think I became interested in this topic too, working with children and just seeing families and really, thankfully I have not experienced, domestic violence in the home, but seeing little children who've had to experience that, it kind of gave me a passion for it. Why is this happening? How is this affecting, people in the home? So domestic violence, when we hear that, that's really, that's something that you could witness. It's not necessarily just between two people who are married or two people in a relationship. It could be different types of actual abuse. It could be elder abuse or different things that are being experienced in the home, like
Mhm.
thinking of like a domestic situation. Interpersonal violence is violence that occurs between two people who are in an intimate relationship. And that could be a man and a
Okay.
woman, it could be two women, it could be two men, but anybody who has that intimate relationship.
Okay. And they don't have to be cohabitating, I guess.
No,
Yeah.
no, that's a good point. No, they don't have to be living together.
Mhm.
And there's all these different types of violence too. There's actual physical violence, and then there's emotional abuse that can take place. There's stalking. There's different forms of abuse too.
Mhm. Why, why do you think this is happening?
That's
Any
such a good question.
ideas?
Yeah, I know that's it's so like me to be like I really get when I really can't understand something, I get very interested in it. And
Mhm.
that's exactly what has happened here. I'm like, why? If two people care and love about each other, why is this an issue? And I think I've talked, it's pretty prevalent. 1 in 5 women have been abused in an intimate relationship, and it's 1 in 7 men. So that those are pretty high numbers. If you really start talking to people, I would say almost a lot of people have really experienced it at some point in their life, or know someone close to them who has. So I don't know why I mean, it would be great to understand more like why is it happening, but it definitely is happening.
Yeah. I I feel like probably there's lots of different reasons, right? Obviously, when we're dealing with things like traumatic brain injury,
Hmm.
where somebody has a very limited locus of
Yeah.
control
Hmm.
and other things are happening, the
Right.
circuits aren't firing
Yeah.
and wiring the way they're
Hmm.
supposed to. I think people easily can get escalated to a scary place.
I
Uh,
think
s-
so.
and then when like drugs and alcohol are involved,
Absolutely.
obviously.
I would have assumed that, it always involves substances, but I that's actually not the case. It's most of
Mhm.
the time it does involve substances, but it actually occurs without any substance use too. We do know that people who engage in the abuse, almost all of them were abused by themselves, at some point, or have witnessed or been through some trauma. So that is a reason, I guess we could kind of say why, if you will, but it's almost like because they've experienced that.
Right. It makes me think of the word intergenerational trauma, right? Where
Yeah.
um, if you're listening and you're not familiar with that term, it's really how we pass down our traumas from generation to generation. And that can be genetically because trauma changes our genes, it changes us. And then we pass that information down. It could also be from like nurturing, right? What are we doing in our environment and repeating what we learned?
Yeah. Like it's normal, right? This is, what we do kind of a thing.
Yeah. So how, what are the indicators? Like if somebody's in a situation and they're like, I think everything's okay. I think like everything's fine. What are some of the indicators that suggest there may be some interpersonal violence or relationship
Hmm.
abuse? Maybe it's not physical because physical is overt and we can
Hmm.
kind of we know that's wrong, right?
Hmm.
Like we know our partner isn't supposed to hit us
Hmm.
or punch us or
Right.
whatever extreme happens. But what about when it's more covert? What are some things that people need to be aware of to say like, okay, maybe I need to question
Hmm.
what's happening here?
Well, that's a really good question. And I'm not sure if this is answering it, but I think one thing is just really asking people, hey, how is everything going in your relationship, especially as clinicians? Um, Maybe not assuming that everyone's in a healthy relationship because we do know that it is so high. If you really start asking people, you really might be surprised. Um, I have a couple of certifications in different screening tools that people use, and I was just shocked because I do some medical social work, as you know. And if you even ask some women, have you been choked? Have you been strangled? And when to actually hear what people say, yes, my jaw just almost drops, and I try to have try not to put people
Yeah.
to see my reaction, but um, I guess just maybe asking. And then I know your question was really more, what are the signs? That's a really good question. I have to think about that, Rena. But I guess, just listening to what people are saying or what they're not saying or how they're describing their partner or maybe their own self-esteem. If you see someone who's
Mhm.
just like, wow, they just feel like they don't feel very good about themselves or they just, I think that might be an indicator right there.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, definitely if you're with somebody who is saying unkind things or hurtful things or demoralizing in some capacity, that's going to have an impact on how you think about yourself,
Right.
right? Which we know how we think about ourselves, what we believe to be true about us, impacts the way we show up in the world. It impacts how we feel, but also impacts how we engage with others, what we'll tolerate from others.
Absolutely. What is it? You teach people how to treat you? Kind of, and
Yeah,
I've heard that.
yeah. We teach people how to treat us for sure. If I say no and then I compromise on that no, I'm teaching the other person that I won't hold my boundary. And if they push, I will submit to whatever it is that they're trying to squeeze out. And not to say that all boundaries have to be super rigid, but I think that could be an indicator if you find
Mhm.
yourself saying yes when you really want to say no.
Right.
That could be an indicator there's some discrepancies in the power dynamics within a relationship.
Absolutely. And I think too, it's not always, you think traditional man it's usually men who are abusive to women. I feel like it could also very easily be women who could be abusive to men, maybe not physically as much, but maybe emotionally. Um,
Mhm.
I'm sure there's more that goes on than we realize because a lot of men probably wouldn't really want to talk about that.
Yeah, I would imagine that it might be one of those weird, like bias statistics because of
Yeah.
we're relying on people's self-report to collect this data or police reports to
Mhm.
collect the data. And it could be really emasculating for a man to say that their wife is beating up on them,
Yeah,
you know?
absolutely.
Yeah. If somebody does find themselves in this kind of relationship, what's the best way for us to approach it with them so that they feel comfortable to come back and to continue to talk with us? Because I feel like no matter your gender, no matter who you are as a person, to say, I'm in this situation and I feel stuck here, and this person who I deeply care about maybe even have children with, maybe have been with for
Mhm.
decades, is abusing me. And that's
Mhm.
such a vulnerable thing to
That
share and so
absolutely is.
scary.
Yeah. Absolutely. I'm a big believer in normalizing things, and I don't know if that's always good or not, but I think really trying to maybe normalize the experience for a client, again, not to keep using the statistic 1 in 5, but that's pretty high. So maybe, trying to help them feel like this is something that some people experience. And it doesn't have to necessarily mean that this the person that you're with is an awful, terrible monster.
Hmm.
Maybe this is something that we could work on together. Maybe we could talk about it or get, some accountability going on or some maybe some marriage and family therapy. Some people go to their church and seek out guidance there. And I have actually really seen couples walk through this and come out, stronger together.
Hmm.
But I think you just have to keep talking about it. But like you're saying, you don't want to make someone feel embarrassed and then they never come back.
Right. Yeah, especially I think because what do you know about how how long it takes for somebody to actually leave a
Oh
situation
my,
like
it's
that?
take a lot of, I mean, it's many multiple tries. And for a person who's really being physically abused, when they leave the situation is when they're at the most risk of being killed.
Mhm.
Not to be morbid, but it's almost like it's a scary time. If someone has really decided like, hey, I'm done, we're not even working on this. And when they leave, it's usually it's a very volatile time.
Mhm. That's when they're at the greatest risk. Um, yeah, I'm just thinking, like, how do we help somebody like
Yeah.
prepare for that and to make sure that they understand that risk?
I really am a big believer too in safety planning. I feel like that maybe I have a little bit of, yay, something I have control over here. Um, it kind of gives the person, especially if they're already dealing with their own self-esteem issues and the embarrassment. Again, often this is someone that they love, like you're saying. Maybe they do have children with them. Maybe they've been with this person for years. Um, Helping them develop their own plan. Who is your support system? Maybe have a little to-go bag, ready to go with medications, some money in it, just anything you can just be like, hey, I need to get out of here. Um, Maybe talking about safe areas. I know that sounds kind of weird, but bathrooms and kitchens are not in an ideal location to be getting into an argument. Um, and this one's kind of people probably have a different reaction about, but also noticing your partner's triggers and not by any way saying that it's your fault that you're being abused or anything like
I'm
that, but
sure.
how do we de-escalate the situation? Let's read the room. If
Mhm.
your partner's not in a great mood that day, maybe, try to maybe go for a walk or give that person some space, if that makes sense. So maybe talking about when do you notice this is happening? That way you can maybe see if there's a pattern going on. And it gives
Mhm.
them a little bit more control of the situation too.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that would be really important. I think too, for people that are in those situations, they have like a strong ability to read the other person and their mood
Hmm.
and to be able to identify like today's not a
That's
good
not,
day.
yeah, yeah. Uh,
Um,
with the Super Bowl coming up, and I think we
oh,
should mention that they have noticed that there's higher percentages of domestic violence and interpersonal violence following an upset loss to a football games, especially like when the home team was really projected to win or different things. So I find that very interesting.
that's fascinating. So, yeah, football influences the whether or not somebody will act out.
I guess it makes sense. You think too, there might be some alcohol involved with, parties and football, and
Mhm.
then people get really invested in these situations.
Right. That's interesting now that we're talking about it because the Super Bowl is like a high relapse day as well
Oh, I did not
in the
realize that.
substance abuse community.
Okay.
Yes. So in that work that I do, we talk about what,
Mhm.
planning,
Yeah.
planning and preparation to make sure that, people that are recently on their journey of sobriety, that they have steps in place to be
Right.
able to manage any urges or avoid watching the game with other people who
Hmm.
may not be in addiction and maybe imbibing themselves. So I imagine there's a strong relationship between the intoxication and the
Yeah.
abuse, even though you had already shared that it's not
Yeah.
necessarily always,
Right.
yeah,
Very interesting.
it is really interesting. Um, when people come in and say they're experiencing abuse, but their partner is is not necessarily willing to take responsibility for what they've been doing, but they really want to try and work it out.
Hmm.
What do you do in that situation?
I think that's a really good question. And I think something that we had kind of talked about before is as a clinician, still working with people who don't really want to leave the situation. Because I
Yeah.
feel like I have to kind of check my own biases there and my own judgments and really trying to, support your client and empowering them to make their own choices. So I guess you just really try to walk it through with them and say, okay, if this is something you're going to stay in and your partner isn't willing to change, what are your boundaries here? Like, what are you willing to accept? What are you not willing to accept? What can you do to keep yourself safe and your family safe if you have younger children?
Hmm.
Um, I guess really like letting them explore how they're feeling about it and what they can do. Um, is there somewhere else you could stay? Or is there, do you have friends that are family that live near you? Maybe it doesn't mean you're not with this person anymore, but maybe you need to kind of remove yourself from living, in the same environment.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. I I like that strategy of really remembering like it's about them. It's about what they get to decide what their goals are, what they're
Mhm.
working towards. And even though we may see not being in that relationship is a better option than being in the relationship, if that's not what they're ready to do, we have to support them through that. On the opposite side, you had mentioned bias, and it makes me think most times I think people are very biased towards the person who is committing the abuse or like acting out
Right.
violently. And how can we kind of cultivate a level of awareness around that and some compassion to be able to kind of, I think, establish if we end up having a client like that,
Hmm.
and we establish a relationship with that person to to be able to help them towards um, really seeking batterers intervention
Yeah.
level services, which I think are really important, especially if they can be in a group setting with other folks that have been doing the same
Mhm.
thing. I think that can go a long way. Like, what are some ways we can respond more effectively?
Well, thankfully, the rehabilitation rate is actually, I feel like, quite promising for people who've engaged in that behavior. Um, I've really seen people come out completely, different than when they started, when they really have gotten the intervention and the treatment that they needed. Statistically, if the rates of recidivism, we're talking about interpersonal violence, they seem to be what you would think. Like if someone has, been very violent and they have a strong history of being very violent and they've, engaged in these behaviors a long time, it's less likely for them perhaps to come out as rehabilitated. But for some people who maybe this hasn't been a long-standing pattern, but they've
Mhm.
just kind of found themselves engaging in this behavior, if they're given the tools to kind of start learning how to, first of all, recognize the triggers in their own body, um, really getting them to see, how did I get from 0 to 100? How did I get here? Um, you know, what was going on in my body? Was my heart racing? Were my teeth clenched? What were my thoughts? Was I thinking, gosh, this person is such an idiot? Or, how was I feeling? Was I feeling angry? And I know that this sounds silly, but really just getting people to kind of recognize their own reactions to things.
Mhm.
And then from there, learning how to de escalate themselves and self regulate their mood, maybe removing themselves from the situation. It's really, I mean, this is why we went into this business, right? Like it's a beautiful thing to see someone recognize, when they're starting to get heated and learning how to calm themselves down.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's really important and something I think a lot of people struggle with. It's not necessarily something that we're taught to do, to tune in,
Hmm.
to notice what's going on in our body, to notice those subtle cues. And I mean, that's a lot of work that we do with young children, right? When
Hmm.
they're first learning how to regulate their emotional experience. I feel like when that doesn't happen, we don't have that support when we're younger, it's really hard as an adult.
Hmm.
There's so many things out there, and as we get older, our problems get bigger.
Right.
They don't go away, although some teenagers seem to think like, when I turn 18, everything's going to be so much better, and they have no idea.
Yeah.
Right. But if we don't learn those foundational skills, when we're younger, it
Hmm.
makes it much harder as an
Right.
adult. And I think for many people that end up in these kinds of situations, that's part of it. They just didn't learn the skills to be able to successfully navigate conflict in a
Hmm.
relationship, to express
Hmm.
emotions in a healthy way, and especially with anger, right? Or it could be
Hmm.
sadness, it could be
Right.
fear, because anger
Hmm.
is usually a secondary emotion.
Hmm.
So, and I think if we're talking, in gendered terms and gender norms, what young boys and men are taught
Hmm.
is not to feel sad or fear,
Right.
not to, boys don't cry, right? That's
Yeah.
a whole thing. So instead, it's more encouraged to be expressed as anger,
Hmm.
and it's more socially acceptable for
Right.
some reason,
Hmm.
than it is with girls.
Right.
Now, maybe that's changing as
Maybe.
people are learning more about feelings and emotions and caring for their mental health. We can hope.
I hope so, yeah. And I think this might get a little bit complicated too, but I feel like sometimes people who found themselves in a relationship with interpersonal violence, um, then they go on to a different relationship and
Yes.
they get right back and it's like a different person, but it's not. It's still the same type. So I think that's why it's so important. Even if you're working with a client who's not in an abusive relationship now, but perhaps they were in the past, I mean, it would really be amazing if they could get to the root of what's happened there and what was that kept them staying with that person and how they picked that person, if that makes sense, so they don't repeat that same relationship in the
Right.
future.
Yeah, there's something about our brain that prefers familiarity. And sometimes if we found ourselves living in really dangerous and volatile relationships, that encodes as safe, even
Yeah,
though it's not, right? Safe meaning it feels familiar. I feel okay, right? But
right,
that's before all the stuff happens. But there's other signaling that is happening, and I think that's why people end up in this repetitive pattern of
right.
abuse.
And it's not typically, the first time you meet someone that they show you, who they really are.
No.
So I think some people who have engaged in these behaviors can be really charming, um, and
Yeah.
affectionate, come off as, just way a lot different than when you really actually get to know them, I guess. Or I think maybe too, they dive in a little bit quicker than like a healthy relationship. So it's pretty fascinating, but trying to really look at relationships even as they at the beginning and how do we set healthy relationships. I wish this was something that was taught in school. I think, as you were saying, with children and learning to regulate your mood and your emotions, um, really teaching about healthy relationships and communication is just
Ah,
amazing. That's just such a game changer if you can communicate yourself and how you're feeling.
absolutely. Yeah, we don't really learn about assertive communication, which is essential where there's mutual respect being expressed. Most often it's either passive aggressive, or
Hmm.
aggressive,
Yeah,
and those all have some flaws,
they do.
get us into trouble. So you're right. Like if we can be teaching children how to communicate effectively, how to handle their emotions when they come up, how to withdraw from a situation when it's not a win-win
Hmm.
option. Like, this person is just going to continue and it's going to escalate. Like, it's okay to say, I'm done having this conversation and walk
Hmm.
away, or I need a timeout.
Yeah,
Um, it's hard to do though once we get past a certain point.
I think so. I think
Yeah.
it's, and the other thing it would be nice is to kind of teach, and again, you don't learn about this as kids, but really that empathy piece and like thinking about things from other people's perspectives, I feel like is helpful in these situations. When I have talked to people who have engaged in the interpersonal violence behaviors, um, some of the things that they just assumed that the other person was thinking were way off. Like they did a lot of mind reading, we called it, and they just kind of felt like the other person didn't have their best interest at heart, or they assumed things that really were you wouldn't even see where they got there. Like why would you think that that person was thinking that or doing that?
Mhm.
And I think that that is a result of a lot of trauma.
Yeah. I I I It, I'm probably biased, but I'm going to say it anyway. But I think most of the mental health issues that people experience can be directly connected to trauma in life. I don't think that any of us get out of
I
this
I agree.
experience
Yeah.
without some kind of trauma. And it doesn't have to be, huge. It could be
Right.
really small. It could be a small verbal communication when we're little with a parent, but it's disparaging, and that can feel really traumatizing to a little person because it feels so big, and that person who's saying it is so important to them,
Mm-hmm.
and what they have to say means so much, and the child internalizes it as I'm a bad person or there's something wrong with me, and it sticks, right? Especially if it's a repetitive pattern. It's not overtly this big thing, but covertly it's present, and it's present over a long period of time, and that starts to shape the belief system that that child has about themselves. And I think
Absolutely.
if we don't work on changing those erroneous beliefs,
Mm-hmm.
they run our lives. They run our lives. They choose the person that's going to validate that belief, right? If I come into a relationship as a young person, maybe I had parents that weren't very approving, weren't very supportive, and I'm struggling with feeling confident, feeling of worth
Mm-hmm.
or value, I'm going to select somebody unconsciously,
Right.
select somebody that reinforces those same belief systems because that's the lens
Mm-hmm.
that I'm viewing the world through.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like a confirmation bias,
Yeah.
right? We get the information mirrored back to us that reflects the belief that we hold about ourselves in a given situation. So if we can change the belief, we can really do some amazing transformative work on the behavior, because we act in accordance with what we believe most often.
I would 100% agree with that.
Yeah. So it sounds like for both parties, the recommendation would be to get some trauma treatment.
Yes, absolutely. And it's funny you said no one really comes out unscathed. When I first was working on my license years and years ago, um, there was a veteran that I was actually working with at the time, and he had PTSD. So I was like, oh, I really need to learn a lot more about PTSD. So I was reading books about it, and I was like, oh my goodness, like I have trauma. I didn't know I have, just from
Yeah.
being alive and being a human, um,
Right.
I
Right.
would say we probably all have some sort of trauma that's happened.
Yeah. I think I know this is kind of going off a little bit off of our topic, but I think it's important. We can experience trauma, not know that we've experienced trauma, and still it's impacting us. We can also experience trauma, work through resolving it, and not allowing it to define us. I think once we start to have our identity be about that trauma, which sometimes happens, and people can kind of get stuck in that trauma narrative, that is where it can be really problematic. We don't, we are much more than an experience that happened to us that caused some short circuiting in the body as a means of protection later on, which is, I think, what trauma is. Um, but yes, we all could probably benefit from some trauma therapies. What would be some of the recommended modalities that you would suggest for people who have experienced some trauma and want to work through that, their belief systems?
I'm a big believer in journaling. I do myself do a lot of journaling to kind of process things. Um, the cognitive behavioral therapy that seems to be, a popular with for everything, it seems.
Right. I know it's considered kind of the gold standard
Yeah.
in a lot of ways, but I think
Yeah.
that's only because it's had a lot more, research
Hmm.
done in that in that area. Um, but it's definitely very directed at what we're
Yeah.
thinking, what we're believing to be true.
I like the journaling because I feel like it allows you to kind of reframe, um, almost relearn the memory, if that makes
Hmm.
sense. And maybe trying to find any positive in it at all. Was there something good that came out of this awful thing that happened?
Mm-hmm. So when you say reframe the memory, um, can you share a little bit more about what that looks like?
So I guess as you're kind of walking through, something that happened to you that was traumatic, identifying your thoughts and feelings about it, and really trying to look at the situation differently, um, maybe not as negatively.
Hmm.
And anytime an intrusive thought starts or a negative one where it feels like you've done something wrong, trying to really reframe that and say, I was experiencing a difficult time. I did my best at that moment.
Hmm.
Really trying to kind of take the guilt and the shame out of different traumatic experiences and looking at it maybe from another person's perspective. But it seems like the more you just kind of get it out, if you will, the easier it is to deal with and the less power it has over you.
Yeah, I like that. That's important. The power piece. Because if we're like not reflecting on it and we're believing the erroneous
Right.
statements, then it's controlling us. We're not controlling it. Yeah. I've been doing EMDR, and like personally, I started doing it around when Hurricane Ian happened here. And then I got trained in it myself. And I find that it's an incredible modality for being able to review the narrative. So we get to review visually like a scene from the memory that was
Hmm.
distressing, that's connected to that negative belief that we might have about that situation and who we are in that situation, how it defines us, and we review it and we watch it and we watch it and we notice what's going on in our body. You were talking about that earlier. I like that piece of getting into the body and just noticing all the sensations that are happening, noticing how the memory shifts and change, noticing our cognition in relation to what's happening. And over time, after like doing this process with the bilateral stimulation, is what it's called. So people have like either a light bar. I don't like the light bar because it makes me nauseous. I like to use their like tappers. So you get like a buzz in each hand and it rotates from or alternates from left to right so that you're stimulating both sides of the brain, which kind of facilitates the eye movement that's present in REM sleep, where we process through and filter out and get rid of all the junk from our waking life, right? It's consolidating everything that's going on. And this is kind of tapping into that process that the brain already does, its self-healing process, but through waking time. And eventually people get to an adaptive narrative about it. They are like, oh, wait a minute. Like, I actually did the best I could in that situation. Like you were saying, it's another way of being able to be the observer of our
Hmm.
experience instead of living in our experience. If we can be the observer of our experience, we can start to think about it differently,
Hmm.
create a different story, and that's going to impact how we feel. But when we're in it in the moment, it's very difficult to be the
I,
observer,
absolutely.
right?
Yeah.
And we can get stuck there and stuck
Yeah.
believing these yucky stories that we're telling um, ourselves around that topic. But I think that's an awesome modality to use for trauma treatment.
That's what I've heard. And I'm personally not trained in it, But I will say, when I first heard about it, which is how many years ago now, I was like, that just seems silly. I don't know if I'll be surprised if that lasts. And here it is, it stood the test of time. It's definitely very research based. It definitely has been shown to be one of the number one ways to treat
Yeah.
trauma. So,
Yeah, especially like resistant trauma.
hmm
That, trauma focused CBT stuff didn't work, wasn't effective, or
hmm
other modalities weren't taking away some of the um, symptoms that people experience with trauma, whether that's nightmares or flashbacks and reactivity.
yeah,
When we overreact
hmm
to a situation that's really small,
yeah,
we know that past is present. And if past is present, that means there's probably a trauma memory encoded that's being triggered at that time. So if we can address that and resolve it, then it stops triggering us, you know? Or when it does, we can recognize, like, oh, like I have a choice here. That's actually not correct.
it's very empowering.
Yes, super empowering. So, well, as we wrap up our conversation here about the topic of relationship abuse and IPV or DV, what would you say is like the most important thing people in general, right? Not other clinicians, but people in general should know about this topic,
That
right?
yeah, I think that it's so prevalent, sadly.
Hmm.
So I think we kind of need to stop assuming that everyone's in a healthy relationship, unfortunately.
Yeah. Yeah. And if say somebody is out there working, like maybe, you know, they're working at the hair salon and their
Mhm.
coworker is sharing some stuff
Mhm.
that's like, okay, it's
Yeah.
indicating like
Red
that's probably
flags. Yeah.
red flags. How can people respond in a supportive way versus sometimes I think people mean really well,
hmm
but it comes off being received as judgmental or shameful when people respond, like particularly like, well, why are you staying in that
Yeah.
situation? Or,
Yeah.
those kinds of questions. What would be a better way for people to respond, especially if they're not trained?
I think that's a great question. I think being just being a good friend and not being judgmental and saying, "Hey, I've got your back. If you need anything, I'm here." And maybe not making assumptions that their partner is a terrible person or that you don't like them or anything like that. But hey, if you ever need anything, I am absolutely here, anytime. And just letting them know that you're going to walk through this with them if they choose. Um, if you feel comfortable enough, you could ask the person, hey, are you everything going okay in your relationship? Are you guys having, difficulties? Again, like I was sharing before, when I asked, in the medical arena, hey, have you ever been choked? And people were starting to tell me yes, they'd been choked or strangled. I was just horrified. And that's also a really bad red flag. Just
Mm, yeah.
um, being mindful of if someone's like having headaches and different things. Maybe they're embarrassed and don't want to share what's really kind of going on in the relationship. Those would be kind of some little red flags you could pick up on. But if you don't have any, real experience or training, that's perfectly okay. I think just being a good friend and just letting them know that you're there for them and you're not being judgmental. But
Yeah.
I think they just need some support at that time. And also, it, they're probably kind of struggling with their own self-esteem. So to know that you have somebody who loves you and cares about you and is there for you, that's a big help.
Yeah. Yeah. I think especially in these situations where one of the characteristics is to isolate people away from their support system so they feel as if they don't have
Hmm.
support or somebody that really can be there for them. So, very important.
Yeah.
Well, if people find themselves in one of these kinds of relationships, what are the best places for them to seek out resources for help?
That is a very good question. I always like to plug the crisis line 988. That's always a good one. And they, I believe that they do have resources there. Um, there is an interpersonal violence hotline as well, which, has resources and supports. Um, what do you think, Rena? Can you think of any other
Well, I'm thinking at least here in our local community, there's ACT,
act? Yeah.
Abuse Counseling and
Mhm.
Treatment, which does offer a shelter. So if
Mhm.
somebody is in imminent danger and they need a safe place to go, they can contact ACT, and ACT can help. They'll do like some screening and help
I think they
support.
even financial, like legally, to help with some things too, which is pretty amazing.
Yeah, yeah.
I love this story. I did my internship up in Jacksonville, Florida, and as part of it, I had to go visit like the secret shelter there, and it
Mm,
was amazing. It was so nice. And what I learned was some of the people who'd been through the shelter ended up being very successful and like
mhm.
donated back, and so they have like had a really great domestic violence shelter. I'm like, that is a cool story.
That's that's wonderful. I think it just shows how much it meant for that
Yeah,
person. I also think it speaks to another topic which we didn't cover, which is that this is not a discriminatory
no.
behavior and that it happens within families
Mm.
of all income levels.
I am, I believe it's highly underreported against uh, from prominent homes and people with a lot of money. But I'm sure it takes place nonetheless, unfortunately.
Yep. Yeah, underreported for a variety of reasons. There's so much shame,
Mm.
and there's other things too tethered to
Oh, yeah.
that, right? If you're in a relationship where somebody is taking care of you and financially you're not bringing money into the
Yeah,
household, that's a really difficult thing
that
to
is scary.
leave.
It is. Yeah. And how would you know, that'd be very difficult.
Yeah. Well, the other option is they can always call us. We're here to help. And you're available to see clients. We have other therapists in the practice that are available to see clients that offer EMDR as
Mhm.
well. And so if you're interested and you need that support, you can always reach out to us. Our number is 239-297-7099. And you can find more information about our practice, the continuing education course that Melissa teaches on interpersonal violence and using empowered approaches to assess it and address it on our website, which is www.floridaarttherapyservices.com. And there you can find more information about Melissa, myself, and the other therapists here. So thanks for joining us today to talk about this really important topic.
Thank you, Rena.
All right. Bye.